In this video, I show you how to back up Azure VMs with Azure Backup. Hello everyone, I'm Travis and this is Seraltos. An understanding of Azure Backup is a requirement for the AZ-103 exam and also important for anyone who manages Azure virtual machines. This is the first in a series of videos on implementing and managing Azure Backup. In this video, we go over the following topics. We start with an overview of Azure Backup. We talk about RPO, RTO, and the importance of data retention. We go over the differences between Azure Backup and Azure Site Recovery and review what VSS is and how it solves common backup problems. The demo includes setting up a recovery services vault, creating a backup policy, backing up an Azure server, recovering the server, and because it's inconvenient to recover a full server in the event you just need a couple files, we go over how to do a single file recovery. Before I go any further, please take a second to subscribe. In return, you'll have the warm fuzzies knowing that you did something good for the day. Let's jump into it with some concepts and terms. I know, not the most exciting, but these are terms and concepts that you'll need to understand before digging in. This could be a little dry, but trust me, they're important. Let's start with what Azure Backup is. Azure Backup is a cloud-based backup solution. Azure Backup offers several advantages, including native backup to the cloud. It can back up Azure servers, on-premises servers, or servers in other cloud providers. It works with a backup client or with the Azure Backup Server or System Center Data Protection Manager. It's scalable, you only pay for what you use. A hybrid option stores data on-premises and in the cloud. Unlimited retention and app-consistent backups. All in all, Azure Backup is a full-featured backup solution with the ability to back up in Azure, on-premises, or other cloud providers. Let's talk about the difference between Azure Backup and Azure Site Recovery. Before that, there are three terms that are important when talking backup and site recovery. They are RTO, or Recovery Time Objective. A file recovery may take a few minutes. An entire server or a large database could take hours to recover. RTO is the acceptable amount of time allowed for that recovery. RPO, or Recovery Point Objective, this is the acceptable age of data to be recovered. For example, if you only back up once a day, the RPO would be 24 hours. The data could be up to a day old when it's recovered. To get an RPO of 6 hours, that would require backing up 4 times a day. Retention, this is how long the backup data is kept. I have personally seen retention policies of strict 30 days, as well as regulatory requirements of several years. There could also be a requirement to store copies of backup data off-site to, say, a cloud provider, for example. Data retention, RTO, and RPO are based on business policies. These are what management expects or deems necessary based on cost, regulatory, and business requirements. They are the basis of any backup strategy, and backup systems are designed to meet these requirements. Let's get back on track with how Azure Backup differs from Azure Site Recovery. Backups are kept for recovering data if something gets deleted or corrupt. Maybe a system update is applied and needs to be rolled back. Backups have a short to medium RTO. Subjective, I know, but for most places it would be acceptable for a 1 to 2 hour turnaround on file recovery. Backups have a longer RPO. Again, subjective, but if backups happen 4 times a day, the RPO could be up to 6 hours. Backups have longer retentions, months to even years depending on the requirements. Azure Site Recovery, on the other hand, is intended to get entire environments up and running on another site in the event of a disaster. They have a minimal RTO. The objective is to get the site up and running in minutes. There's a minimal RPO. Again, the objective is in minutes. Bringing an environment online from a 6-hour-old backup would not be ideal and could introduce significant data loss. ASR continuously replicates changes to keep the DR copy in sync. Site recovery also has minimal retention. Old data is not helpful for bringing a DR site online. While it could be possible to recover a server at a different site with Azure Backup, it could take minutes to hours depending on the size and circumstances. For environments that have more than a handful of servers, it could take days to stand up servers in a recovery environment. Not ideal in a disaster event. ASR is intended to bring up entire environments online in the event of a disaster. ASR is not intended for data recovery. That's what Azure Backup is for. Both Azure Backup and Azure Site Recovery use the Recovery Services Vault in Azure, but offer different services. Before we dig in, I have one last topic to cover. The topic is Azure Backup Policies. A backup policy is a schedule for how frequently backups or recovery points will occur. This maps directly to the RPO requirement. If the RPO is 24 hours, a daily backup will meet that requirement. If the RPO is 1 hour, hourly backups would be required. However, Azure IaaS Servers and Azure File Share Backup policy only provides daily backups. The Azure Backup agent allows for up to 3 backups a day. SQL database backups on IaaS servers provide hourly log backups with daily full. A backup policy also sets the retention for different types of backups. This maps directly to the business retention requirement. Different retention policies can be set for daily, weekly, monthly, or yearly backups. Also, not all servers have similar retention or RPO requirements. Multiple Azure backup policies can be created to fit different requirements. We'll set up a backup policy in the demo. Now that we know about RPO, RTO, retention policies, and the difference between Azure Backup and Azure Site Recovery, let's move on to an overview of the demo. You will need an Azure subscription and a Windows server in Azure if you want to follow along. If you're working on a certification, I recommend getting hands-on experience with this. First, we're going to set up a Recovery Services Vault in Azure. This is the location for managing Azure backups. Next, we're going to back up and recover an Azure VM. Azure VMs use the Azure VM Agent Backup extension to back up the entire VM. If you only need to back up a select file on an Azure VM, that can be done with the backup client. More on that in an upcoming video. Once that's done, we'll do a single file recovery from an Azure backup. Buckle up everyone, it's demo time. So in this demo, the first thing I'm going to do is set up a Recovery Services Vault. Here I am in the portal, and the first thing I'm going to do is, well, add the Recovery Services Vault. There it is. Here I'm going to click Add to add my first Recovery Services Vault. And I'm going to create a new resource group. We'll call this, I'll call it CIR Central Vault RG. That looks good. I'm going to give it a name. So the vault name will be, let's just call it Central Vault. And I'm going to select the region. Keep in mind that vaults are regionally specific, meaning if you have multiple VMs in multiple regions, you'll need to create multiple vaults to back those up. It won't back up cross regions. So I'll select Central. We'll go to Review and Create. That all looks good. And Create. I'll just give it a second to finish. Okay, it's done. So I'm going to go to the resource. And notice a few things here. We've got the typical Azure options up top under Settings, for example. And then under Getting Started, there's Backup. This is to get started with backup as well as site recovery. As I mentioned before, a Recovery Services Vault is used for both backups and Azure Site Recovery. So there's options for both. I'm going to stick to the backup option in this video. Here under Protected Items, again, are backup items and replicated items. The first thing I'm going to do is go to Properties, and under Backup Configuration, click Update. By default, a Recovery Vault is set to geo-redundant. And if you're not familiar with the different storage types, I'll include a link up above that goes over the basics of Azure storage accounts. But basically, geo-redundant has multiple copies at different regions, where locally redundant has multiple copies in one region. Now, if I was doing this in production, I would want geo-redundant, but I'm not, and I want to save a little bit of money, so I'm going to switch this to local redundant. Once I onboard a virtual machine, I cannot come back and change this. So it's important that whatever you set here, you're committed for the life of this vault. So I'll click Save and Close Out. The next thing I'm going to do is come down to Manage and Backup Policies. There are a couple policies set already. One's an hourly log backup for SQL servers, and the other one's a default policy. I'm just going to add a policy, and I want to call this daily because this is going to be for daily backups. The backup type is Azure Virtual Machines. I'll call this Daily Backup. And under frequency, I'll leave it at daily. Time, I want to set that to 1 a.m. And I'm going to change the time zone from UTC to, let's see here, Central US. Anytime a backup's made, there's an instant recovery You can select how many instant recovery snapshots you want to keep. I'll leave that at 2. And then if we go down here into the retention range, this is where we can set different retention policies for different backup types. And this ties to the retention we were talking about before. This is really determined by whatever your policy states. But first, for the retention of daily backup points, I cannot change this. It has to retain something. So for daily backups, I'm just going to go 30. I don't need 128 days. Now, if all I wanted to do is keep 30 days of backup, that's all I would need to do. But I do want to keep weekly backup points. I want to keep them for, let's say, 8 weeks. I can select which backup I want to keep for 8 weeks. By default, it's Sunday. I'll leave that there. And then monthly backups, we can do either the week-based or the day-based. I'm going to do week, so we can say the first Sunday. Actually, I want to do the last Sunday, though. So I'll uncheck first and select last. I do not need to keep it for 60 months, so let's just go 12. So these monthly backups, which is the last Sunday of the month, will be kept for 12 months. And then I can also select yearly backups. I've had to retain yearly backups before. Typically it's after like a year-end closing or something. So I'm going to change this from January to December. And I'm going to say on the last, not the first, Sunday. And it's going to keep for, let's just say, 3 years. There we go. Actually, I'm not even going to do that. I'm not going to keep these around anywhere near that. Now that I have the retention item set and the backup time and frequency, I'm going to click Create. I'll go back to Policies, and you can see there's my daily backup policy. Next, I'm going to add a server, and there's a couple ways to do this. If I go to Virtual Machines, I'm going to select one of my virtual machines. And under Operations, there's Backup. Here I can either create a new recovery services vault, or I can select an existing one. Here's the one we just set up. And I can also select a policy, so I can select daily backup. And if I enable backup, that'll be added to the backup policy and the recovery vault. But I don't want to do that. I'm going to go back here to Recovery Services Vault. I'm going to go to Backup Items under Protected Items. And here you can see I don't have anything. I'm going to select Virtual Machine and Add. The workload is running in Azure, and the backup type is a virtual machine. So if I click Backup, first it's going to ask for a policy. I'm going to select that daily backup that I just created. Click OK. And here we get a list of all the virtual machines. So this is a list of all the virtual machines in the region. And from here, I can select multiple. This is handy if you have more than one server you want to onboard. I'm just going to select this one though and click OK. Now I'll enable backup and I'll give it a second to run. What this is going to do is add that Azure Backup extension to the VM that allows us to back this up. Here I'm back at Backup Items, and you can see Azure Virtual Machines now has one item. So if I go in there, we can get an overview, the machine name, the resource group it's in, the backup pre-check is passed, but I get a warning on last backup status, and that's because it hasn't been 1 a.m. yet, so the policy hasn't kicked in to back this up. Now I can do an initial backup on my own by clicking over here under the context menu and selecting Backup Now. Because I'm backing up outside of the policy, it's going to ask me how long I want to retain this backup, so I'm just going to leave it at 30 days and click OK. That backup is going to take an hour or two. So I'm going to, let's first refresh. So I'm going to go over to my Recovery Vault, go into Overview, and here is an Overview tab and a Backup and Site Recovery. Again, we're just sticking with backups. If I click on Backups, we can see a job status, which is 1. That shows something's in progress. If I click on that, there it is. So there's my server in progress. I'm going to go back. You can also see the backup items are here as well. This will take a while to finish. While we're waiting, let's go over VSS, what it is, and how it solves common backup problems. Here's why VSS snapshots are important. Imagine you have a server with a critical application. Data is written to multiple directories on the server every time a transaction is processed. A backup client is on the server, and backups take about 30 minutes to finish. It's possible that these directories on the backup are 10 to 20 minutes apart. One day there's a problem and you have to recover the files, but the time difference between when the directories were backed up are too far apart to be useful. Another potential issue is if the file is opened by another process. Say the user didn't close a document at the end of the day. The backup solution can't get read access to the file, and the file won't get backed up at all. These are both issues backup admins faced in the early days of backing up servers. Windows servers use volume shadow services or VSS to solve problems like this. VSS locks the data on the volume at a point in time. This is referred to as a shadow copy or a snapshot. A copy on write process allows for changes to the volume without modifying that shadow copy. So the server keeps running as normal. The shadow copy is then backed up, not the live data, keeping all backup data consistent. Many applications such as Exchange and Microsoft SQL have hooks into the VSS framework that provide application-consistent backups. This means that application transactions are quiesced and the application will recover correctly. Microsoft has multiple levels of consistency. I'll include a link to this document below. There's application consistency, meaning applications will recover correctly. There's file level consistency, meaning files will recover correctly, but there's no guarantee that the applications will recover. And then there's crash consistent. This is just like if somebody pulled power on a server and then started it up again. That's what the recovery would be like. Linux does not support a framework like VSS. However, Microsoft has a pre and post script that can be configured to support an application consistent backup on Linux. Okay, here I am back. The backup is finished. And one thing I'll point out is we now have a size amount of 11.35 gigs in LRS storage. You can see there's no jobs in progress or failed. I still have the one backup item. Let's go into that. And I'm going to click on Azure Virtual Machines. There it is. It looks like the last backup was a success. And if I click on here, we can start to see the recovery points. And you'll notice one thing right away. This one is crash consistent. So the one we did is actually crash consistent. So why is that? That's because this virtual machine was powered off when I ran the backup. If you remember back on the discussion with VSS, the VSS writer has to interact with the operating system to create that snapshot, and that snapshot gets backed up. Well, if the virtual machine is powered off, there can be no snapshot. So therefore, it's a crash consistent backup. Now, it's kind of misleading because this is a crash consistent backup of a VM that's powered off. So it's kind of like just a copy of a powered off VM. But nonetheless, it's reporting as crash consistent. So let's fix that by going back to virtual machines, and I'm going to power this on. I'll just give it a couple seconds to power on. The server is now reporting as status running. And if you want to see what it's doing, you can always come down into Boot Diagnostics, and you can see the screenshot of the desktop. So that indicates that it's fully booted. It's not just starting, but it's actually starting and waiting at the login screen. So in order to do a backup, I'm going to go into Backups. And here is the same information we're just looking at, but I'm going to click Backup now. I'll leave the retention time to where it is and click OK. Now that that's running, I'll give it a few minutes to finish and I'll come back. Here we are back at the server test01, and you can see the second backup finished, and this time it is application consistent. So that's good. That's what we were looking for. So that means that the VSS writer worked and it was able to QSC all of the I/O and pause that and create a snapshot. And that snapshot is what was used for the backup. I just want to go over one thing because I kind of skipped over it before. But under the backup policy, there's the instant restore. So what the instant restore is that's the snapshot that's created when I create this recovery point. It'll keep the snapshots for 2 days. Now the benefit to doing that is when I do a recovery, it's going to pull the recovery from the snapshot. If it doesn't have the snapshot, then it's going to pull it from Azure Storage, which is going to take a little bit longer. So that's the advantage to keeping these instant restore points around. So with that, let's restore a VM. I'm going to go into Restore. I'm going to go to, let's select the most recent one. And here I've got a couple options. I can create a new or I can replace an existing. I don't want to replace an existing, so I'm going to create a new. I can also restore the disks if I wanted to. That way you could mount the disks up to another virtual machine and read off from them. But that's similar to a file restore, which I'm going to go over next. Let's create a new virtual machine. I'm going to call this test03. And I'll leave it to the same resource group. That's where it came from. I'll leave the virtual network and the subnet. That's all pulling from the existing server. Next, I need to select a storage account. And I'm actually going to hop over and create a new storage account in that same resource group. Let's go to my resource groups, perf test. So this is the resource group of the original VM that I'm restoring. I'm going to add a new storage account. And I'll call it perf recovery. I'll select the same region, standard. I'll do a version 2, and I'm going to change this to LRS and create it. Okay, so we'll give that a second to finish. And while that's finishing, I'll explain why I just did that. I want this server to recover to its own storage account for a couple reasons. First, so I can delete it later because I don't need this. And second, because I don't want to restore it to the same storage account that the original server was on. Now if I come over here, I can select my storage option, and there it is, perf recovery. So I do have the option here to use the storage account of the original VM, and that will recover faster. If the original storage account is missing, however, it's going to add those disks into this as a staging account. So I don't want to do that. I don't want them to recover to that original storage account. So I'll uncheck that and click OK. And I'll click Restore. That's going to take a few minutes to run as well. So I'm going to pause and I'll come back. I'm back at the Overview tab looking at backups, and the restore did finish, although we don't get much indication of that looking at this portal. But what I'm going to look at is I'm going to come down here into Backup Jobs. And here we can see everything that I've backed up, all the tasks that I've done so far. And if we look at this one, we can see a restore operation is completed, and it completed successfully. Now if I go into my virtual machines, we can see test03. Here I am at the Overview tab of the virtual machine, and you can see it is running. So I've restored a VM. This is a copy of test01 to test03. So that was successful. Next, I'm going to do a file recovery because sometimes you don't need to restore the entire virtual machine just to get a file back. So in order to do that, I'm going to go back to, let's go back into the virtual machine. This is the source. I'll go into Backups. And I'm going to do a file recovery this time. This is an interesting way of doing a file recovery that Microsoft came up with. I'm going to download an executable. It does require a password, and it will generate a password once I download it. While we're waiting for that to run, let's look at some of these notes down here. So you want to run the script on the machine that you want to recover the files to. There is a limit of 10 gigs. If the file you want to get back is larger than 10 gigs, you will have to restore the entire VM or restore the entire disk and then connect that to another VM. So I'm going to click download now that this is finished. And it's going to ask me for the password. I'll copy that. I'll enter the password and hit enter. And we can see now PowerShell is running. And it is using an iSCSI service to connect the local machine to that drive. And just so you know, I downloaded the file. I did have to run the executable as an administrator. It won't work under the normal user account. Here's the disk. It's attached as the E drive. And we can see users. We can see my admin user, program files. So it's just like any other drive attached to my local machine, only it's connected back to the restore point using the iSCSI protocol. So let's see what happens when I click on Mount Disk here. We'll give it a couple seconds to unmount. Now Windows Explorer has closed. I can't access that drive anymore, and it's telling me to unmount the disk. That's step 3, which I already did, and press Q to quit. There we go. So that's really it. That's how you do a single file restore. Basically, it generates an executable for you to download. You run that as administrator. It uses the iSCSI service to connect back to the recovery point and mounts that as a local drive where you can copy files off from it. The last thing I'm going to do in this demo is go over removing a recovery vault. I'm going to go to my Recovery Services vault, open it up, and there's actually a couple steps. The first thing you have to do is remove the backup item. I'm going to go into Azure Virtual Machines, select my server, and you would have to do this for every server in the Recovery Vault. I'm going to stop the backup, and it gives me two options: retain the backup data or delete the backup data. If I want to delete the Recovery Vault, I have to delete all the backup data. You can't delete a Recovery Vault until you've removed all of the backup data. I'll type in the name of the backup item and stop backup. Once that's done, I could simply go into Recovery Services Vault and delete, or at this point I could delete the entire resource group once that backup item and all recovery points are gone. I'm not going to do that because I'm not done with this yet, but if you did want to clean this up so you don't incur any additional charges, that is how you do it. Remove the servers, delete the recovery points, and then delete the vault. That's the last item for this demo. Just to recap, in this video we went over what Azure Backup is, we went over what RPO and RTO is, and how those and data retention requirements make up a backup strategy. We talked about the difference between Azure Backups and Azure Site Recovery and reviewed VSS and how it helps solve common issues with backups. We reviewed and created a backup policy. The demo included setting up a Recovery Services Vault, backing up and recovering servers with the Azure Backup extension, as well as a single file recovery. Don't forget to shut down VMs or remove all we just set up to avoid extra cost if it's no longer in use. Stay tuned for my next video on Azure Backup, where I go over using the Azure Backup agent. Subscribe and click the bell icon for notifications of new videos. I hope you found this useful. Thanks for watching.